Good day to you, and yes, I am taking the opportunity here to show you a little sneak peek of a Mexico that many people don't hear about. Not the violent Mexico, not the corrupt Mexico, not the inept Mexico, but the beautiful Mexico with the tropical plants you see behind me, as well as the cactus and the tile and the outdoor patio living. And I'm doing that as we take on the subject of popular music and recorded music. And as the advisor to WESS Radio, the university's radio station at East Stroudsburg University, and also a person who has two music radio shows myself, a Rolling Stones Hour and also a rhythm rock show, I'm privy to a lot of different tastes of music at WESS, as well as amongst young people in college. And I'm amazed at the variety of music that students listen to today. You can find students listening to rock, country, rap, hip-hop, soul, pop, orchestra, Broadway, all kinds of stuff. And I think it's a real credit to people of your generation, if you're in this generation, the variety of musical tastes that you have. But it wasn't easy to get to this stage, and that's what we're going to talk about as we take on this chapter on recorded and popular music, or audio as the book calls it. And we start with the phonograph in 1877. The phonograph was that invention by the most famous inventor of all in United States culture, even more than Ben Franklin, and that's Thomas Edison. And Thomas Edison invented this device that could record music. And think about how profound that is. Before this time, if you wanted to listen to music, you had to have a live performer. You had to go to somebody's salon, a sitting room, and listen to them play piano. You had to have somebody play flute for you. Now, for the first time, because of Edison, we can capture recorded music, although he didn't envision it that way. He envisioned his invention, which looked like a long roll of foil in a cylinder shape that would roll with a needle going across the top. He envisioned it as a dictation device for people to say words to. Well, later on in 1888, along comes Emily Berliner, a German immigrant, and he invents the gramophone. This is a new way, the gramophone, of recording music. It's a way of recording music onto a flat disc, specifically made out of zinc. And that also allowed music to be reproduced quickly. Just like the Gutenberg printing press did the same for newspapers, now music didn't have to be produced in a slow, painstaking process. You could press a disc and then make copies. So now music is starting to get mass dispersed, and it's really changing the face of music itself when you make it available to the masses and not just the few. And we'll talk about how that's the case a little bit later as we talk about some genres of music. But next I want to mention the invention of high fidelity in 1935. Long before we had Wi-Fi, which is wireless fidelity, instead we had hi-fi, which is high fidelity. And it was a method of recording without getting too technical that allowed a song to be listenable to in terms of its highs and its lows, its deep basses and its high trebles. Before that, the song was all compact and muddy. Now, because of high fidelity in 1935, you have a sound of a song that's really full and very pleasing to the ear. Now, parallel to these developments in music, you also have a development that is going to profoundly change not just the instance of communication, but also the way that mass communication is envisioned. And that's because the telegraph in 1844, the next invention, made communication electronic. And this is maybe the most profound development in technology of mass communication I can talk about all semester long or all course long, because prior to the telegraph, if you wanted to communicate in a mass way, you had to carry that communication, you had to transport it, you had to put a newspaper on a train, you had to take a book on your horse and take it to somebody else's town. Suddenly, communication through the telegraph, that device that goes dee 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 dee, suddenly communication is instantaneous. It was used amongst railroads. A railroad operator in Los Angeles could communicate with somebody in San Francisco through a series of dots and dashes. It used a language called Morse code. That communication at that time was not yet carrying voice, but it was enough to communicate instantaneously across distances and vast expanses. So San Francisco talking to California to Los Angeles instantaneously without requiring transportation of the communication is utterly profound in the development of mass communication. Let's move on though, because there were some limitations, because you had to have the telegraphs connected by cable, so if that cable got cut, you'd lose the communication. So along came a bunch of researchers trying to break through with the next device that would avoid that problem. And Heinrich Hertz was one of them. He was an electrical engineer, and he came up with a theory that you could actually send sounds through the airwaves using molecules and using frequencies. They didn't know what to call those frequencies, but later on, Guglielmo Marconi was the person who really made the whole thing come true, because he invented Guglielmo Marconi in Italian. He invented the wireless telegraph in 1894. The wireless telegraph suddenly allowed you to send music and other kinds of messages, voice messages, through the airwaves. And what a profound difference that made in the way that people could communicate, because it basically laid the foundation for radio. But at that time, radio was used as a point-to-point medium. It was used in the military very much. It was used between one ship and another ship as they were passing through the night. I mean, you're way out there in the middle of the Atlantic or the Pacific. Radio was a godsend, if I can say it that way, for travelers on ships, because you could communicate without having to flash lights at each other. But still, it was seen as a point-to-point form of communication until David Sarnoff, who actually came out of the military, he went to work for Edison's company, Thomas Edison Patent Company, and he broke away. And as part of his breakaway, he had this profound idea called the radio music box. In 1915, the radio music box was a kind of box that would sit in a person's house and it would play music for people. And this was magic. A box playing music instead of seeing somebody with a trombone. That was really absolutely fantastic for people. So he really came up with the concept of a radio station. And in fact, in 1920, we get our first radio station right in Pennsylvania at KDKA in Pittsburgh. And what happened was there was an election between two presidential candidates, Cox and Harding, and Westinghouse, a company that was part of a mix of a bunch of other companies, which you'll read about in the book, that made up the monopoly of RCA, the Radio Corporation of America. Westinghouse, one of the smaller companies, came up with the idea of taking a transmitter and putting it on the tallest building in Pittsburgh and then broadcasting, and that word comes from farming, by the way. When you plant seeds by throwing them and scattering them and hope that 10 to 15% of them germinate, you're broadcasting instead of planting each individual one. So when Westinghouse put the transmitter at the top of the building, which allowed it to send its signal as far as possible in Pittsburgh, it was in effect creating the concept of a radio station. And so radio stations, combined with the ability to record music now, give birth to this tremendous industry of sound recording. And the very early kinds of recordings that went on were in radio's golden age. The golden age was from 1920 to the 1940s, roughly. This was when there was no television. This was when radio was king over newspapers. And in the golden age, you could find many of the genres that you find on television on radio in that golden age. So you could find soap operas and mysteries and sci-fis and news programs and sports programs and comedies and variety shows and on and on and on and on, all on radio. And the average person's living room in their house was arranged around the radio receiver, with it at the end of the couch where you could reach back and turn the knobs. And families would come and sit and listen to the radio. What they did with their eyes, I don't know. Imagine sitting in a room listening to radio, but radio was king in the 1920s through the 1940s. And it very quickly became a kind of medium that books, not so, maybe books a little bit, but not so much newspapers, definitely not television, and I wouldn't say the smartphone or the internet either, but radio became a companion medium. It was by your side. It made you feel like you always had somebody there because there's voice coming out of this magic box. You had a personal relationship with it. Even today, people who drive in cars who listen to their favorite radio programs, they feel that they have a personal connection with the disc jockey. So radio became a companion medium. Also, though, radio killed, in a way, the whole idea of social music. That is, getting together and listening to a person play a violin or a cello or a piano, and everybody sitting around and singing and joining in and spending the evening doing that in somebody's parlor, in somebody's salon, somebody's house. Yes, we still have that today, and in fact, I think the book misses a point here that many people still get social music today from going to listen to bands, from having friends in college who play guitar and sitting around, from having other people who like to sing and perform in front of them. It still exists, but at that time it certainly changed and diminished social music because people were listening to music on the radio as this medium started to spread. And so what also happened was music and radio got tied in with the expanse of youth culture and society. Prior to this time period, the 50s on upwards, young people didn't really have a say in the mass media. The mass media were completely controlled by old-timers, parents and grandparents and corporate heads. But when radio takes off, now the youth are starting to have an interest and a voice and a means of expression, because it was the young people who started to form bands. It took a while. 1948 to 49 is a watershed year. In 1948, music was played very much, popular music was played very much by African American musicians in the U.S. The records that they put out were called race records because of their race. They came mostly from the Mississippi Delta, where a lot of music was spread down throughout the slave plantations, with people singing and chanting and then turning that expression into playing blues music. But later, after 1948 into 1949, it gets changed into R&B, rhythm and blues, and radio stations started to call this genre rhythm and blues. And one of the first artists was Wynonie Harris and his song Good Rockin' Tonight, which introduces the idea that blues combined with country and a little bit of gospel soon formed a genre that is still around today, a genre that pushed radio out and distributed it in ways that were never imaginable. I'm talking about rock and roll. And in rock and roll, you have two pivotal figures. You've got Elvis Presley, who was portrayed as a person who could sing African American music to people who were not yet willing to accept African American music being sung by African Americans. It had to be a white person to be commercially marketable. So Elvis Presley actually never wrote his own music, but he performed a lot of music that came out of the Memphis area, the Deep South, that has its roots in slave and plantation and rhythm and blues culture. But that wasn't the case for Chuck Berry, the second figure. Chuck Berry, an African American, really is probably more responsible for inventing rock and roll than anybody else. He had much more of an electric guitar sound, and he was the one who pushed rhythm and blues into a rockin' sound, a harder sound, a fun sound. Not that rhythm and blues isn't, but a sound that was more palatable to the masses on radio. So this gave birth to rock radio. And rock radio, of course, today has many different genres. There's alternative rock, there's classic rock, there's modern rock. You even have rock fused with other genres, hip-hop included. But rock and roll was what it was all about in the 1960s. Just prior to that, though, I don't want to fail to mention the Motown era, named after Motortown, or Detroit, because that's where a lot of the music came from. We're talking about gospel combining with doo-wop, and we're having a lot of singers and vocalists with big bands, big backing bands, and very soulful music. Motown music came out of the Detroit in the 1950s. In the 1960s, we have the British invasion. We have a lot of bands, the Rolling Stones, my favorite band, is also the Beatles, and Pink Floyd, and a bunch of others, Led Zeppelin and whatnot, coming out of Britain, bringing over to the United States a British invasion because their music was being played all over American television. Yeah, television too was around by then, but also on the radio. And along with music became it was evolving. Along with music, an involvement of the producer came into effect, and the whole idea that it's not just the band anymore as it is to have a person who can get you into the studio, who can mix your music, who can bring in sounds that you didn't envision. Like, we want an orchestra, the producer goes out, gets an orchestra, brings it in, and the producer is chopping up the bits and pieces of the song and moving them around and fixing the mixing levels. There are other people involved, but it's the whole idea that music in the 1960s starts to be produced. And part and parcel of that is the idea of multi-track recording. This is where you can record one instrument, usually a bass or drum, and then after that's recorded, come back and listen to it, but at the same time add the vocals, and then go through and then come back and add a trombone or add a xylophone or a harmonica. This allowed music to be super produced without even artists having to be in the same studio at the same time. And so today, two genres that are worth noting because of their change and their recency in the music industry is hip-hop / rap. There are major differences, of course, but hip-hop is different from other genres in the past because it combines DJing, dancing, and lyrics. Now, the book says rap, but I really say lyrics. It's brought lyrics to the forefront of the song, even though the lyrics are often controversial. More about that in a moment. But the lyrics have become the first part of the song and the main part of the song that you hear in rap, which wasn't the case during rock music, which is mostly bass guitar or rhythm guitar. Then also you have country. Country used to just be a southern musical form with twangy guitars and mostly older males singing about it, but it broke through and spread across the United States by adopting beautiful singers, females and males, presenting them on television, and also adopting more rock and roll in its sound. Less twangy guitar, more electric guitar. So country now is actually the most popular format amongst radio stations across the United States. It's the number one format because it's broadened its appeal. Now, along the way, a lot of critics have had concerns about the effects of mass music particularly on youth culture. In the area of hip-hop and rap, there's been a lot of concern about misogyny. If you don't know that word misogyny, it means the mistreatment of women. It means putting them down, subverting them, sometimes abusing them. Rap lyrics calling them hoes, etc., are a good example of misogyny and allegations of misogyny, as well as gang violence and the way that it's portrayed with bling and all the rest of the rewards that seem to come with having a life of crime are portrayed in some hip-hop songs, obviously not all, but it's a concern of music critics. In the area of rock and roll, there's a concern, as there is also for hip-hop, about drugs and the glorification of drugs. There's lots of songs that talk about blunts and all the rest of the kinds of drugs that are available. And then sex is something else that's also pop music is criticized for, encouraging promiscuity, encouraging infidelity, encouraging following your urges, and then finally alcohol as well. Now, to finish up this chapter, we just want to mention the mediums. I said that wasn't a word before, so I just want to introduce it here and then backtrack immediately to say media. But I want to emphasize that word medium, which is why I mention it in its incorrect plural form, because we want to talk about how the media of sound recording have evolved. In the beginning, it was that foil that Edison invented, and then it went to a disc made of zinc. And then it went to vinyl. Vinyl's still around today, still making a comeback, still very accessible, still creating tones that you don't hear in digital music, which is why it's so popular. It was the LP, or the long play, had usually 5 songs on the front, 5 songs on the back. There was also the 45, or the single, which you still see today, a band releasing a single. You can find that on iTunes, or you can find that on a band's own website. That was a small disc. It was called a 45 because of how many revolutions it did per minute, 45 revolutions per minute. After that came the CD. It's the first time that we have digital music being digitized. A lot of people are very happy about that because it means that music could be copied. A lot of people are very upset about it because digital music, to the audiophile, a person who's an expert in audio, believes that it's not as rich as analog music. After the CD, we have the MP3 that comes along, which allows computer files to contain music and to be shipped across email. And now we find ourselves with clouds, music stored in clouds. And all these various services like Pandora, Spotify, even radio stations streaming. It's basically music is somewhere up here. We don't have to carry around our device. All we need is a device that plays back music. So it's still recorded, it's still portable, but now all we really need to concentrate is having something that is high enough fidelity and has enough memory that it allows us to listen to the music of our choice. So here you have an introduction of audio. I hope you enjoyed this chapter. It's going to pave the way now to talk about radio and then later television. Have a great day from Mexico. Adios.